The restaurant was nearly empty at 2 a.m. Just a hum of a dying neon sign and the clink of silverware being cleaned in the back. She sat across from him, mascara slightly smudged, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. This was the third time this week she'd called him after midnight. The third time she needed to hear his voice, needed him to tell her everything would be okay. He leaned back in the vinyl booth, watching her with an expression that gave away nothing. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have noticed if he disappeared for a week. Now she couldn't go 3 hours without texting him. What changed? He did nothing obvious. No grand gestures. No desperate declarations. In fact, to anyone watching, it would seem like he barely tried at all. But that's exactly the point. There's a passage in The Prince that most people misunderstand. Machiavelli writes about power, about control, about the mechanisms through which one person bends reality to their will. But he's not talking about force. He's talking about architecture. The construction of invisible systems that make others believe they're choosing freely when really, every path leads back to you. This isn't about manipulation in the crude sense, not the kind that leaves fingerprints and resentment. This is about becoming the axis around which someone else's emotional world rotates so gradually and so completely that they don't even remember a time when it was different. Watch how Master does it. He never overwhelmed her with attention in the beginning. When they first met, he was pleasant but distant, engaging but never pursuing. She'd text him, and sometimes he'd respond in minutes. Other times, hours would pass. There was no pattern she could decode, no system she could game. This irregularity did something to her brain chemistry that constant attention never could. Every time her phone buzzed, there was a spike of dopamine, a little hit of pleasure mixed with relief. Was it him? This time, it was. But sometimes it wasn't. That unpredictability, that variable racial reinforcement schedule, the same principle that makes slot machines addictive, it was embedding itself into her neural pathways every single day. He never made himself the center of her world by demanding to be. Instead, he created a vacuum. When they were together, he was present, magnetic even, making her feel like she was the only person in the room. But then, he'd disappear into his own life with such completeness that she'd start to wonder if she'd imagined the connection. Not cruelly, not with explanation or justification, just the natural ebb and flow of someone who had a full existence beyond her. And here's where it gets fascinating. She started structuring her entire emotional landscape around his presence and absence. Good days became the days she heard from him. Bad days were the silence. He didn't create this dynamic by force. He created it by absence, by being someone whose attention had to be earned rather than expected. There's a woman in his past who taught him this, though not intentionally. She was the one who could make him feel like a god with a glance and completely invisible the next moment. He remembered the torture of it, the way his mind would spiral trying to understand what he'd done wrong, trying to map the territory of her affection. He remembered how it consumed him, how she became the lens through which he interpreted everything. And somewhere in that pain, in that analysis of his own addiction, he understood the formula. He saw the architecture, not to repeat what she'd done with malice, but to understand the mechanics of emotional gravity itself. So with this woman in the diner, he did something most men never have the discipline to do. He withheld his full presence, not his attention when he was there, not his affection when he gave it, but the certainty of it. He remained slightly unknowable. When she'd ask him what he was thinking, he'd smile and say something true but incomplete. When she'd try to define what they were, he'd be honest that he cared about her, but refused to rush into labels that felt premature. This wasn't game playing. This was maintaining a sovereign self, a core that she could orbit but never fully possess. And paradoxically, this is what made her want to possess it more. Machiavelli understood that power isn't taken, it's given. Real control comes when someone hands you the keys to their emotional state voluntarily, eagerly even. She started doing this without realizing it. She'd have a hard day at work, and her first thought was to tell him. She'd see something funny and want to share it with him. She'd lie in bed at night, and the thing that determined whether she could sleep peacefully was whether they talked that day. He became her emotional regulator, the barometer by which she measured her own well-being. And he didn't demand this role. She appointed him to it because he created a space where his presence meant something, where it wasn't guaranteed, wasn't constant, but when it arrived, it was undeniable. The genius of this approach is its sustainability. Relationships built on constant intensity burn out. The man who's always available, always accommodating, always there becomes furniture. Comfortable perhaps, but not essential. Not the thing you think about when he's gone. But the man who maintains his own center, who has a life that doesn't revolve around her validation, who can disappear into his purpose and emerge with stories and energy, this man becomes a source rather than a drain. She doesn't tire of him because he never depletes himself trying to be everything she needs. Instead, he remains something else entirely, something separate and therefore valuable. Now here's where the philosophy gets deeper. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a guide for rulers, but his real insights are about human nature itself. He observed that people don't follow those who serve them, they follow those who lead them somewhere they couldn't go alone. In the context of emotional connection, this means you can't create dependence by making yourself a servant to her emotions. You create it by being a portal to emotional states she can't access without you. When she's with him, she feels more alive, more herself, more possible. Not because he's doing anything to her, but because his own completeness, his own centeredness, gives her permission to access parts of herself she's repressed. He challenges her, but not confrontationally. He asks questions that make her think differently about herself. He shares perspectives that expand her worldview. He introduces her to music she's never heard, ideas she's never considered, ways of seeing that recalibrate her entire approach to life. And crucially, he does this while maintaining a frame that she's capable of understanding these things, that she's intelligent enough, deep enough to meet him in these spaces. This does something remarkable to her self-concept. She starts to see herself through his eyes as someone more complex and capable than she believed. And now his presence isn't just pleasant, it's identity defining. Without him, she's not sure she can maintain this version of herself. But here's a mechanism that seals it. He's inconsistent in all the right ways. His availability fluctuates. His warmth has weather patterns. His attention is a resource that must be earned through genuine connection, rather than expected as a baseline. This creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning that exists. When a reward comes every time, we adapt to it, expect it, take it for granted. When it comes, sometimes unpredictably but not rarely, we become obsessed with the conditions that produce it. She finds herself analyzing their interactions, trying to understand what makes him engage deeply versus when he's more distant. She's not doing this consciously or manipulatively. She's doing it because her brain is trying to solve a puzzle that yields the reward of his full presence. And he's not playing games in the cruel sense. He's simply living according to his own needs and rhythms, rather than molding himself to hers. Some days he's social and expansive. Other days he needs solitude to work or think, or simply exist without performance. He doesn't apologize for this or explain it excessively. He just is. And this authenticity, this refusal to be anything other than what he actually is in any given moment, is more attractive than any consistent persona could ever be. Because it's real. Because it's sovereign. Because it suggests depth and complexity rather than a simple program running to please her. The woman in the diner finally looks up at him, her eyes searching for something she can't quite name. She wants to ask him where this is going, wants to secure some promise or definition that will ease the anxiety of uncertainty. But some part of her knows that the moment he gives her that, the moment he becomes predictable and secured, something essential will vanish. The very thing that makes him magnetic is his refusal to be contained completely. He reaches across the table, touches her hand briefly, and tells her she should get some sleep. She nods, disappointed but also strangely satisfied, because he's still him, still the same mystery she can't quite solve, still the person whose attention feels like winning something rather than simply receiving it. This is the dark art that Machiavelli understood and that most modern men have forgotten. You don't make someone dependent on you by being everything they need. You make them dependent by being something they can't quite have fully, something that remains just beyond complete possession. Not through cruelty or withholding, but through maintaining an authentic self that has depths she hasn't plumbed, ambitions she doesn't fully understand, a life that continues with or without her blessing. The psychology of female attraction is often misunderstood as a checklist of qualities to possess or behaviors to perform. But what really creates that magnetic pull, that emotional dependence, where she can't imagine her life without you, is a construction of emotional architecture. You become the space where she feels most herself. You become the mirror in which she sees her best version. You become the variable that determines whether her day feels full or empty. And you achieve this not by inserting yourself forcefully into every corner of her life, but by being selectively, powerfully present in ways that leave an absence when you're gone. Think about addiction for a moment. Not the chemical kind, but the behavioral kind. What makes something addictive isn't its constant availability. It's the perfect balance between satisfaction and longing, between reward and anticipation. The gambler doesn't get addicted to winning every time. He gets addicted to the possibility of winning, to the intermittent reinforcement that keeps his hope alive. The same principle applies to emotional bonds. Constant availability creates comfort but not craving. Intermittent presence, especially when that presence is high quality, creates an emotional addiction that's far more powerful than any relationship built on mere consistency. He understands this intuitively now, but it took years to learn. He watched men more successful with women than him and noticed a pattern. It wasn't that they were more handsome or wealthy or charming, though some were. It was that they maintained a center of gravity that existed independent of female validation. They had missions, purposes, paths that would continue whether any particular woman was there or not. And women sensed this. They sensed that these men's attention was a choice rather than a need, a gift rather than a plea, and that made all the difference. So he rebuilt himself around this principle. He invested in his work until it became genuinely consuming, until there were days when he'd forget to check his phone because he was deep in flow state. He cultivated friendships and interests that had nothing to do with dating or women. He developed a relationship with solitude, learning to enjoy his own company so thoroughly that he never felt desperate for someone else's presence. This wasn't a tactic. This was genuine self-construction. But the effect on his relationships with women was dramatic, because now when he gave his attention, it came from abundance rather than scarcity. It was valuable because he had other places he could invest it. And women felt this immediately. The woman he's with now, the one who calls him at 2 a.m., didn't start out dependent on him. She was independent, successful, had her own full life. But slowly, without either of them planning it explicitly, he became essential to her emotional ecosystem. Not because he forced himself into that role, but because the quality of presence he offered, intermittent but intense, created an experience she couldn't find elsewhere. With him, she felt understood without having to explain herself. She felt challenged without being criticized. She felt safe enough to be vulnerable but uncertain enough to stay engaged. This is the Machiavellian insight applied to modern relationships. The prince maintains power not through constant displays of force, but through the careful construction of systems where his authority is simply assumed. In relationships, you don't maintain attraction through constant pursuit or attention. You maintain it through the construction of an emotional dynamic, where your presence is the variable that determines her emotional state, where she's organized her inner life around your availability, where you've become not just a person she likes, but a regulatory force in her psychological world. And here's the ethical question that arises. Is this manipulation? Is this emotional abuse? The answer depends entirely on intention and execution. If you're constructing this dynamic to exploit someone, to extract value while giving nothing real, then yes, it's deeply unethical. But if you're doing it because you're genuinely building a sovereign self, because you're actually pursuing purpose and maintaining boundaries and being authentically variable in your availability based on real life demands, then it's simply the natural result of being a complete person. The dependence that emerges isn't manufactured. It's the organic response to encountering someone who isn't trying to be everything to everyone, but is powerfully something to those who earn his focus. Machiavelli's critics call him amoral, but a deeper reading reveals someone who simply understood human nature without the veneer of wishful thinking. People are not always rational. They are not always motivated by fairness or reciprocity. They respond to patterns of reward and punishment, to the perception of scarcity and abundance, to the feeling of earning something versus having it given freely. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't make you evil. It makes you effective. And more importantly, it allows you to construct relationships based on reality rather than fantasy. The reality is that desire requires distance. That mystery generates more attraction than transparency. That unavailability, when balanced with genuine quality of presence, creates more lasting bonds than constant attention. These aren't pleasant truths for the modern mind that prefers narratives of equality and complete emotional availability, but they are truths nonetheless, visible in every relationship that maintains passion over years versus those that decay into comfortable companionship devoid of charge. So what does this look like in practice? It means you audit your availability. You stop being the man who responds instantly to every text, who rearranges his schedule at her whim, who has nothing better to do than wait for her attention. Not because you're playing games, but because you genuinely have other things that matter to you. Your work matters, your physical training matters, your personal growth matters, your friendships matter. She is important, but she is not everything. And this reality, communicated through behavior rather than words, reframes the entire dynamic. It means you maintain mystery. You don't explain everything. You don't share every thought and feeling the moment it arises. You process internally. You have an inner life that remains partially private. Not because you are hiding things, but because complete transparency eliminates the space for imagination and projection that keeps attraction alive. She should know you, but she should never feel like she completely understands you. There should always be depths she senses but hasn't fully explored. It means you challenge her. You don't agree with everything she says to keep the peace. You offer different perspectives. You push her thinking. You hold frame when she is emotional rather than getting swept into her storm. You become the stable center around which her emotions can orbit, the fixed point that allows her to express the full range of her feelings because you won't be destabilized by them. This doesn't mean being cold or dismissive. It means being rooted in something beyond her approval. It means you lead. You make decisions about where to go, what to do, how to spend time together, not tyrannically, not without input, but from a place of confidence and vision. Most men abdicate this responsibility because they fear being seen as controlling. But what they don't realize is that by deferring every decision to her, they're communicating that they have no direction of their own, no vision worth following. She doesn't want a servant who asks her preference on everything. She wants a partner who has a path and invites her to walk it with him. The woman in the diner finally stands to leave. He walks her to her car, and she looks at him with an expression mixing frustration and adoration. She wants more from him, more certainty, more availability, more of whatever it is that makes her feel the way she does. But she also knows, on some instinctive level, that the moment she gets it, it will lose its power. So she accepts the ambiguity. She accepts the intermittent nature of his full presence. She accepts that he's a complete person with or without her. And in accepting this, she becomes more attached than she would be if he gave her everything she consciously thinks she wants. This is the paradox at the heart of Machiavelli's wisdom. People don't value what comes easily. They don't cherish what's always available. They treasure what must be earned, what remains slightly out of reach, what challenges them to become more than they are. By maintaining your own completeness, your own center, your own life beyond any one person, you become infinitely more valuable than if you dissolved yourself into service of their needs. And here's the final insight. This approach doesn't just create emotional dependence in her. It creates genuine respect. It creates the conditions for authentic attraction rather than the comfortable decay of relationships where both people become less than they were. Because you're not trying to be her everything. You're trying to be your fullest self and inviting her to meet you there. That's not manipulation. That's leadership. That's the application of ancient wisdom to modern relationships. That's how you create a bond that doesn't just last but intensifies over time. Because it's built on reality rather than fantasy, on desire rather than obligation, on the magnetic pull of your authentic self, rather than the desperate grasping of someone trying to be whatever he thinks she wants. This is the path few men have the discipline to walk. It requires you to build something real beyond relationships. It requires you to tolerate the discomfort of her uncertainty rather than rushing to reassure. It requires you to lose some women who need more constant validation than you're willing to provide. But for those who can walk this path, the rewards are relationships where you're genuinely desired rather than simply needed, where your value increases rather than depreciates over time, where emotional dependence flows from authentic attraction rather than manufactured scarcity. The script you just heard isn't theory. It's applied psychology drawn from observation and experience. It's the wisdom of Machiavelli filtered through the lens of modern relationship dynamics. It works because it's based on how humans actually function, rather than how we wish they functioned. Use it wisely. Use it ethically. Use it to build relationships of genuine depth rather than shallow manipulation. Because the greatest power isn't making someone dependent on you, it's becoming someone worth being dependent on. If this perspective challenged how you think about attraction in relationships, that was the point. If it made you uncomfortable, that's probably because it contradicted narratives you've been sold about how connection works. The question isn't whether these principles are pleasant, the question is whether they're true. And if they are, whether you have the courage and discipline to apply them in your own life, that decision is yours. But now you know what's possible. Now you understand the architecture. What you build with that knowledge will determine the quality of your relationships for the rest of your life. So here's what I want you to do right now. If this video gave you insight into relationship dynamics you've never considered before, hit that subscribe button because we're going deep into masculine psychology every single week. If this challenged your thinking in ways that made you see your own relationships differently, smash that like button and help this reach other men who need to hear it. Drop a comment telling me which principle hit hardest for you. Was it the intermittent reinforcement, the importance of maintaining mystery, or the idea of leading rather than serving? Your engagement tells me what content to create next. And if you know a friend who needs to understand these dynamics, share this video with him. Real knowledge isn't gatekept. It's spread to those who are ready to use it. The algorithm rewards engagement. So take 30 seconds right now to interact with this content, and I'll keep bringing you the psychology that actually works instead of the fantasy that keeps men confused and unsuccessful. This is just the beginning. Subscribe and let's continue this journey into the truths about attraction, power, and authentic masculine presence.